Before we get into the chapter, however, I thought I should let you all know what edition of the book I am reading. I know it's been hard for lots of people to grab copies of Black Bolshevik ever since it went out of printing, but I know a couple of companies have been printing their own editions of it. I have my edition from Pravda Media. I know there are other companies that are printing their own edition, so if you wanted to get your own copy, you can find it online. Also, if you notice that in your own copy there's any major differences between my copy and your copy, that is the reason why. And if there's any horrifically incorrect information that are in my edits, please let me know so that I can talk about that in post and be able to correct that for the future. So, without any further ado, let's get into Chapter 2 of Black Bolshevik. Chapter 2. A Black Regiment in World War I. On the Negroes, this double experience of deliberate and devilish persecution from their own countrymen, coupled with a taste of real democracy and world-old culture, was revolutionizing. They began to hate prejudice and discrimination as they never hated it before. They began to realize its eternal meaning and complications. They were filled with a bitter, dogged determination never to give up the fight for Negro equality in America. A new radical Negro spirit has been born in France, which leaves us older radicals far behind. Thousands of young black men have offered their lives up for the lilies of France, and they've returned ready to offer them again for the sunflowers of Afro-America. W.E.B. Du Bois, June 1919. Despite my bitter encounter with racism in school, I liked Minneapolis. I was impressed by the beauty of the city, with its many lakes and surrounding pine forests. The racial climate in 1913 was not as bad as my early experience in school would indicate either. Blacks seemed to get along well, especially with the Scandinavian nationalities, who constituted the most numerous ethnic grouping in the city. Upon quitting school, I became a part of a small black community and completely identified with it. I found friends among the black boys and girls in my age group, attended parties, dances, picnics at Lake Minnetonka, and ice skated in the winter time. Here, as in Omaha, a ghetto had not yet fully formed, though there were the beginning of one in the black community on the north side. Included in the black community and among my new friends were a relatively large number of mulattoes, the progeny of mixed marriages between Scandinavian women and black men. This phenomena dated back to the turn of the century. At the time, it was the fashion among wealthy whites to import Scandinavian maids. Many of these families had black male servants, butlers, chauffeurs, etc., and the small black population was predominantly male. The result was a rash of intermarriages between the Scandinavian maids and the black male house servants. The interracial couples formed a society called Manasseh, which held well-known yearly balls. As the whole of the children of this group were a hot-headed lot and seemed even more racially conscious than the rest of us. It was in Minneapolis that I too reached a heightened stage of racial awareness. This was hastened, no doubt, by the tragic events in South Omaha, and the fact that I was now an adolescent, and there was the problem of girls. I had noticed that it was the period of pubescence that a black boy, raised in even in communities of relative racial tolerance, was first confronted with the problem of race. It had been so with my brother Otto in Omaha, and now it was so with me. During the first year after dropping out of school, I worked as a boot black, barber shop porter, bellhop, and a busboy, continuing in the last long enough to acquire the rudiments of the waiter's trade. At the age of 16, I got a job as a dining car waiter on the Chicago Northwest Railway. As the first run was also my first trip to the big city, where I had 4 aunts, my mother's sisters. All through my childhood, my mother had told stories about her first visit there at the time of the Chicago Exposition. Upon arrival, one of the older waiters of the cars, Lon Holiday, took me to see the town. I'm sure he looked forward to showing a young innocent the ropes. After a visit to my aunt, he took me to a notorious dive on South Side. It was the back room of the salon at 32nd and State Street. The piano man was playing the boogie-woogie style, popular in those days. The few couples on the floor were walking the dog, balling the jack, and so on. Then one of the dancers, a woman, called to the pianist, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, please play those dirty motherfuckers." He enthusiastically complied, and sang a number of verses of the bawdy tune. I almost sank through the floor in embarrassment and even amazement. Lon, who was watching, burst out with laughter and said, "Boy, you ain't seen nothin' yet." He then took me to the famous Mecca Flats on Federal Street, where a rent party was in process. There he introduced me to a young woman who he evidently knew, and slipped her some money, saying, "Take care of my young friend here. Be sure to get him back on the car in the morning. We leave for Minneapolis at 10 a.m. The railroads were a way to see the country, and in the months that followed I took advantage of that. I worked for different lines, on different runs for as far west as Seattle. One run in Montana, called the Loop, the dining cars shuttled between the Great Falls and Butte by the way of Helena, stopping at each town overnight. It was known as the Outlaw Run, and I soon found out why. It attracted a number of characters wanted by police in other cities, searching for escape or a temporary hideout. While laying over in Butte one night, our chief murdered the parlor car porter, cut his throat while he was sleeping in the parlor car. They had been feuding for days. I went through the parlor car that morning and was the first to see the ghastly sight. The police came, but the chef had disappeared. My enthusiasm for the job was gone. It might have been me, I thought, for I had had a number of arguments with the chef about my orders. I quit and headed back to Minneapolis, arriving there shortly after the war broke out in Europe in 1914. I was 16 and had been avidly following the news, following the reading of the invasion of Belgium, France, and the Battle of Marne, etc. One day, while walking along Hennepin Avenue, I saw a Canadian recruitment sergeant. He was wearing the uniform of the Princess Pat Regiment, a bright red jacket and a black kilt. A handsome fellow, I thought, looking like a bonny Prince Charlie himself. He noticed me looking at him and asked, "You want to join up with the Princess Pat, my lad? We've got a number of black boys like you in the regiment. You'll find you'll be treated like anyone else up there. We make no difference between the black and white in Canada." I imagined myself in the red jacket and black kilt. I said, "Sure, I'll join." Then he looked at me closely. He asked, "How old are you?" 18, I lied. "Your parents living?" "Yes." "Well, you've got to get their consent." "Oh, they'll agree," I said. "They live in the city?" "Yes." "Well, you come back here tomorrow and bring one of them with you, and I'll sign you up." "Okay," I said, but I knew that my parents would never agree. And well, it was, too, that I had later learned that this regiment was among the first victims of the German mustard gas at Ypres, and what was left of them was practically wiped out at the bloody Passchendaele at the Somme front. Life in Minneapolis was beginning to bore me. I was too anxious to get back to Chicago, the big city, so I moved there and stayed with my Aunt Lucy at 43rd and State. In 1915, my parents, at the urging of my mother, also moved to Chicago, and then I stayed there with them. In Chicago, I got a job as a busboy at the Tip Top Inn, then considered the finest restaurant in town. It was owned by an old man. It was owned by old man Hieronymus, a famous chef, and was noted for its French cuisine and service. In the trade, it was taken for granted that you had been a waiter at the Tip Top Inn. You could work anywhere in the country. After a few months, I promoted to waiter and felt that I had perfected my skills. During the next 3 years, I worked at a number of places: the 20th Century Limited, the New York Central's Crack Train, the Wolverine, Michigan Central, the Sherman House, the Old Palmer House, and the Auditorium. During this time in Chicago, I saw Casey Jones, a black man and legendary characters known to at least 4 generations of black Chicagoans. As I remember, he was partially paralyzed, probably from cerebral palsy. He would go through the streets with trained chickens, or he put through various capers, shouting, "Crabs, crabs, I got them." He had a defect in speech, which he exploited. The audience would literally fall out at his rendition of the popular sentimental ballad, the curse of an aching heart. You made me what I am today. I hope you're satisfied. You dragged and dragged me down until the heart within me died. Although you're not true, may God bless you. That's the curse of an aching heart. Then there was the beloved comedian Steering Beans, who was often appeared at the old Peking Theater at 31st and State Street. The Dolly Sisters also appeared there, and they were very famous at the time. Tina Jones' slush night spot was at 35th and State Street. Then at the Panama, another nightclub, I would listen to Mommy Smith sing Shimmy Sha Wabi, That's All, a very popular song and dance at the time. Once when I wanted to go back to Minneapolis to visit, I caught the Pioneer Limited, riding the rods, out in the station on the west side. This was my first experience in hoboing. I rode the rods as far west as Beloit, Wisconsin. At Beloit I got off, but I was afraid to get back on because a yard dick was going around the cars. I stayed there overnight, a fairly cold night as I remember. I met a white man, a professional hobo, who took me in tow and told me about the trains leaving at the morning. He said we would catch a train that would pull us right into Minneapolis. It was a passenger train, and we could ride the blinds in, that is, the space between the two Pullman cars. We rode the blinds, reaching LaCroix, Wisconsin. On the way, he warned, you know, there's a bad dick up in LaCroix. We gotta watch out for him. When the trains passed up in LaCroix, both of us hopped off. The other guys were flying out the train from all sides, from the rods, the blinds. There were some on top, too, but notorious yard dick caught us. He was a rough character, and let us know as he lined us up. Hey, up there. I was on the end of the line of about a dozen guys, and was the only black there. I had my hands in my pocket. Take your hands out of your pockets. I took my hands out of my pockets. The engine's fireman was looking at us, watching all of this. He called over to the yard dick. Say, Jim, let me have that young colored boy over there to slide down the coal for me into Minneapolis. The dick looked at me and scowled. All right, you get up there, he shouted to the fireman, but see that he works. I'll see to that. He'll work. I scrambled on the engine tender and slid coal all the way to Minneapolis, where I got off at the station. Among my new friends in Chicago, there were several members of the 8th Illinois Black National Guard Regiment. They would regale me with the tall stories of their exploits on the Mexican border in the summer of 1916, when the regiment took part of a show of force against the Mexican Revolution. None of us, of course, knew the real issues involved. I remember reading the exploits of the famous 10th Cavalry, Black 10th Cavalry Regiment, which was part of a force sent by General Funston across the border in pursuit of Pancho Villa. They had been ambushed by Villa, and a number of them had killed. The papers on that occasion had been full accounts of the heroic black cavalrymen and their valiant white officers. The 8th, however, had been in the rear near San Antonio, Texas, and saw no action during the abortive campaign. Intrigued by their experiences, I joined the 8th Regiment in the winter of 1917. I was 19. The regiment, officered by black folks from the colonel on down, many of them veterans of the 4th Black Regular Army Regiments, gave me a feeling of pride. They had a high esprit de corps, which emphasized racial solidarity. I didn't regard it as just part of the U.S. Army unit, but as some sort of a big social club of fellow racemen. Still, I knew that we would eventually get into the war. That did not bother me. On the contrary, romance, adventure, and travel beckoned. I saw possible escape from the inequalities and oppression which the lot of us blacks in the U.S. I was already a Francophile. I had read and heard about the fairness of the French with respect to the race issue. It seemed now, as I look back upon it, that patriotism was the least of my motives. I was avidly following the news of the war, and it seemed certain that the U.S. was going to get involved, despite the protest of President Wilson to the contrary. Already the press was whipping up the sentiment. Tin Pan Alley joined in with a rash of jingoistic songs. Don't bite the hand that's feeding you. Let's all be American now. Ad nauseum. All this left us cold. However, the song that brought tears to my eyes was Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, Joan of Arc, do your ears from the skies see the foe? Can't you see the dropping of Fleur-de-Lis? Can't you hear the tears of Normandy? Joan of Arc, let your spirit guide us through Awake old France to victory, Joan Arc, we're calling you. Truly, nothing was sacred to Tin Pan Alley. The Lusitania was sunk. The U.S. declared war in 1917. Our regiment was federalized on July 25, 1917, and in the late summer, we were on our way to basic training at Camp Logan, near Houston, Texas. A demagogic promise was the wide circulating things that would be better if blacks fought loyally. For example, there was the statement of President Wilson, "Out of this conflict, you must expect nothing less than the full enjoyment of full citizenship rights." This propaganda was immediately belied by the mounting wave of new lynchings in the South, which claimed 38 victims in 1917 and 58 in 1918. Worst of all was the East St. Louis riots of September 1917. At least 40 blacks were massacred in a bloody pogrom that lasted several days. There was a mutiny riot in 24th Infantry in Houston, Texas, where our regiment was to receive basic training. Company G of our outfit was already in Houston at the time, and had been sent on as an advanced detachment to prepare the camp for our occupation. It was through then that I learned exactly what had happened. Black soldiers of the 24th Infantry, as old regular Army regiment, had for months been subjected to insult and abuse by Houston police and civilians. The outfit had stationed its military police in Houston, who were, in theory, supposed to cooperate with local police in maintaining law and order among soldiers on leave. Instead, the black military police found themselves the object of abuse, insult, and beatings by local police. This treatment of black MPs by racist cops was evidently encouraged by the fact that they, the blacks, were unarmed. A report on the special on-the-spot investigator for the NAACP published in the crisis, its organ reads, In deference to the Southern feelings against the arming of Negroes and because of its expected cooperation of the city police department, members of the Provost's Guard were not armed, thus creating a situation without precedent in the history of this guard. A few carried clubs, but none of them had guns, and most were without weapons of any kind. They were supposed to call on white officers to make arrest. The feeling is strong, and among the colored people of Houston, that this was the real cause of the riots. On the afternoon of August 23rd, two policemen, Lee Sparks and Rufe Daniels, the former known to the colored people as a brutal bully, entered the house of a respectable colored woman in an alleged search for a colored fugitive accused of crap shooting. Failing to find him, they arrested the woman, striking and cursing her, forcing her onto the streets, only partly clad. While they were waiting for the patrol wagon, a crowd gathered about the weeping woman, who had become hysterical and was begging to know why she was being arrested. In this crowd, a colored soldier, Private Edwards. Edwards seemed to have questioned the police officers or remonstrated with them. Accounts differ on this point, but they all agreed that the officers immediately set upon him, beat him to the ground with the butts of their six-shooters, continued to beat and kick him while he was on the ground, and arrested him. In the words of Sparks himself, I beat the N-word until his heart got right. He was a good N-word when I got through with him. Later, Corporal Baltimore, a member of the military police, approached the officers and inquired for Edwards, as it was his duty to. Sparks immediately opened fire, and Baltimore, being unarmed, fled. They followed him, beat him up, and arrested him. It was this outrage which infuriated the men of the 24th Infantry to the point of the revolt. When word of this outrage reached the camp, the feelings ran high. It was by no means the first incident of that kind that had occurred. White officers, feeling that the men would seek revenge, ordered them disarmed. The arms were stacked in a tent guarded by a sergeant. A group of men killed the sergeant, seized their rifles, under the leadership of Sergeant Vita Henry, an 18-year-old veteran, marched on Houston in company strength. When the soldiers left the camp, the slogan was, "On to the police station." They entered the town by way of San Philip Street, which ran through the heart of the black community. The fact that they took this route and avoided a more direct route, which led through the white neighborhood, disproved the charge by local newspaper and the police that they were out to shoot up the town and kill all whites. Their target was clearly the Houston cops. On the way to the station, they shot every person who looked like a cop. Finally meeting resistance, a battle ensued. The battle ensued, which ended with 17 whites, 13 of them police, killed. The alarm went out, and a whole division of white troops, which was stationed in the camp, was sent to round up the mutineers. Finally cornered, the men threw down their arms and surrendered, with the exception of Sergeant Vida Henry, who committed suicide rather than be taken. The whole battalion of the 24th Infantry, including the mutineers, was hurriedly placed aboard a guarded troop train and sent to Fort Huancha, Arizona. Immediately on arrival, those involved were given a drumhead court-martial. 13 were executed, and 41 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. The bodies of all the executed men were sent home to their families for burial. I remember reading of the funeral of Corporal Baltimore in some little town in Illinois. Our regiment entrained for Camp Logan with our ardor considerably dampened by these events. Indeed, we left Chicago in angry and apprehensive mood, which lasted all the way to Texas. We passed through East St. Louis in the middle of the night. Those of us who were awake were brooding about the massacre of our kinsmen, which had recently taken place there. The regiment traveled in 3 sections, a battalion each, in old-style tourist cars, sort of second-class Pullmans. The next morning we arrived in Jonesboro, Arkansas, our first stop on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line. We were in enemy territory. For many of us, it was our first time in the South. Jonesboro was a division point. All 3 sections of the trains pulled up to the sidings while the engines were being changed and the cars serviced. It was a bright, warm, and sunny Sunday morning. It seemed like the whole town had turned out at the station platform to see the strange sight of armed black soldiers. Whites were on one side of the station platform and blacks on the other. We pulled into the station with the windows open and our 1903 Springfield rifles on the table in plain view to the crowd. We were our provocative best. We threw kisses at the white girls on the platform station, calling them out. Come over here. Baby, give me a kiss. Look at the pretty redhead over there. Ain't she a beaut? And so forth. A passenger train pulled up beside us on the next track. There, peering out the open window, was a real stereotype of the Arkansas redneck. The sight of him was provocative enough for Willie Morgan, a huge black in our company, who originally was from Mississippi. Morgan was sitting directly across from the white man. He undoubtedly retained bitter memories of insults and persecutions from the past, and quickly took advantage of what was perhaps his first opportunity to bait a cracker in his own habitat. He reached a big ham-like hand through the window, grabbed the fellow's face, and shouted, "What the hell you staring at, you peckerwood motherfucker?" The man pulled back. His hat flew off. Bending down, he recovered it and moved quickly to the other side of the car, a frightened and puzzled look on his face. Our whole car let out a big roar. Then a yardman, walking along the side of the car, asked, "Where you boys going?" "Going to see your mama, you cracker son of a bitch," came the reply. The startled man looked up in amazement. All of us were hungry. We had been given only a couple of apples for breakfast, and we had noticed now that there were a number of shops and stores in the street behind the station. I believe our first thought was to buy some food. The vestibule guards would not allow us to take our rifles off the cars, so we left them on the seats and proceeded to the stores in groups. As the stores became crowded, as the storekeepers were busy serving some of our group, others started to snatch up any articles of sight. Cases of Coca-Cola, ginger ale, the near beer, went back to the cars. The path to the train was strewn with loot dropped by some fellows. In the stores, some bought as others stole. This spontaneously evolved pattern was employed in the raids on all stores in Jonesboro and at other train stops along the road to Houston. The only serious confrontation that took place that day involved the group I was with. We crowded a little store, and a fellow named Jeffries, one of my squad buddies, approached the storekeeper, who was standing behind the counter. Putting his money down, he demanded a Coke, whereupon the guy said, "I'll serve you one, but y'all can't drink it in here." "Why?" Jeffries asked innocently. "Because we don't serve N-words here." Just as we were about to jump him and wreck the place, Jeffries, a comedian, decided to play it straight. He turned to us, say, "Now wait, fellas, let me handle this. This man is saying that you don't know your place." Turning on the storekeeper, he put his money down with a feigned meekness and said, "All right, mister, give me a Coke. I know my place. I'll drink it outside." Thank goodness this N-word's got some sense, the storekeeper must have thought as he placed the Coke on the counter. Geoffrey snatched at the bottle and immediately hit him on the head, knocking him out cold. We then proceeded to wreck the place. We took everything in sight. Rushing back to the train, I heard a loud crash. Plate glass window someone had smashed as a parting gift to the N-word-hating storekeeper. Up to this time we had not seen any of our officers. They had been up front in the first-class Pullmans. Many of them, we suspected, were sleeping off the after-effects of parties held on the eve of our departure. Major Hunt and Captain Hill now appeared and gave orders to the non-coms and the vestibule guards to no one else allowed to leave the train. We waved goodbye to the blacks at the platform station. They looked frightened and sad and cowed. We were leaving, but they had to stay and face the wrath of the local crackers. The train headed to Texarkana. The scene where it was repeated, though only in smaller scale. In Texarkana, the train stopped only a few minutes, and we raided one store near the railroad station. I was the last one out, running to the train with a box of pilfered Havana cigars in my hand. Nearing the train, I passed a couple of local whites talking about the raid. One of them said to the other, "You see all those N-words taking that man's stuff?" "Yeah, I see it. Well, what are we going to do about it?" I just reached the train, and just as it was pulling out, relieved not to have been left behind to find out the answer. The next stop was in Tyler, deep in the heart of Texas, scene of our most serious confrontation. Here we confronted the law in the person of the county sheriff. Tyler seemed to be a larger town than the others. It was a division point, and all three sections pulled up on the sidings. As in Jonesboro, a large number of crowd gathered at the station, blacks on one side, whites on the other. Again, with our guns in view, we started flirting with the white women, throwing kisses at them, and so on. We were very hungry. There had been some foul-up in logistics, so there wasn't any food on the train. All we had that day was a couple of sandwiches and some coffee. We piled off the train and headed for the stores, elbowing whites out of the way. We didn't carry our guns, but many of us wore our sheathed bayonets. Major Hunt finally appeared, but he was only able to stop a few of us. By that time, most of us were already ransacking the stores in the immediate vicinity of the station. The path back to the station was strewn with bottles of soft drinks, hams, fruits, wrappers from the candy, and cigarettes, etc. The major was frantically blowing his whistle, calling the fellows back to come back to the cars. Finally, we all got back, and we were eating our pilfered food, drinking our near beer and soda. Suddenly, a large white man stepped out of the crowd. He wore a khaki uniform, a Sam Brown belt, and a Colt .45 in his holster. He approached Major Hunt and identified himself as the sheriff, or he might have been the chief of police. He said he intended to search the train and recover the stolen goods. The major, a short, heavy-set black man, said, "No, you don't. This is a military train. Any searching to be done will be done by our officers." "I know," he said. "I want to accompany you." "No, you don't. You won't set foot on this train." The sheriff hesitated and looked around at the crowd of white and black. It was clearly a bitter pill for him to swallow, having for the first time in his life take low to a black man in front of his white constituents, as well as setting a bad example for the blacks. He pushed the unarmed major aside and walked forward. "Come on, you Peckerwood son of a bitch," we hollered from the car. He approached the vestibule of our car, where Jimmy Bland, a mean, gray-eyed man and light-skinned black, was on guard. "Back! Get back, or I'll blow you apart," Jimmy pushed the sheriff in the belly with the barrel of his rifle. To further impress upon him that the gun was loaded, he threw the bolt and ejected a bullet. The sheriff, who had doubled down from the blow, straightened up, his face ghastly white. He gasped out something to the effect that he was going to report this affair to the government, and walked away. We all let out a tremendous roar. We arrived in Houston the next day, 5 days after the mutiny on the 24th. We were informed that $5 would be docked from each man's pay to cover the damages incurred on the trip down. I believe we all felt that was a small price to pay for the lifted morale that resulted from our forays on the trip. We were greeted by our comrades from Company G of our battalion on arriving at Camp Logan. They had been there at the time of the mutiny riot and gave us a detailed account of what had happened. We expected to be confronted by the hostile white population, but to our surprise, the confrontation with the 24th seemed to have bettered the racial climate of this typical southern town. Houston in those days was a small city of perhaps 100,000 people, not the metropolis it has now become. The whites, especially the police, had learned that they couldn't treat all black people as they had been treating the local blacks. I can't remember a single clash between soldiers and police during our 6-month stay in the area. On the contrary, if there were any incidents involving our men, the local cops would immediately call the military police. There was also a notable improvement in the morale of the local black population, who were quick to notice the change in attitude of the Houston cops. The cops had obviously learned to fear retaliation by black soldiers if they committed any acts of brutality and intimidation in the black community. Houston blacks were no longer cowed, intimidated people they had been before the mutiny. They were proud of us, and it was clear that our presence made them feel better. A warm and friendly relationship developed between our men and the black community. The girls were especially proud of us. The local blacks would point out places where some notorious N-word-hating cops had been killed. "See those bullet holes in the telephone pole over there?" they'd say. "That's where that bad cop, old Pat Grayson, got his. Those 24th certainly were sharpshooters." I occasionally took my laundry to an elderly woman who had known Corporal Baltimore. She told me what a nice young man he was. "I hear he was hanged," she said. "That's right," I replied. Tears came to her eyes, and she cluckled. "He left some of his laundry here. You're about his size. You want it?" "Yes, I'll take it." She handed me several pairs of khaki trousers and some underwear and shirts, all washed and starched, and insisted that I pay only the cost of the laundry. In Camp Logan, our black regiment, a part of the 33rd Illinois National Guard Division, went into intensive training. We had high esprit de corps. Our officers lost no opportunity to lecture us on the importance of race loyalty and race pride. They went out to disprove the idea spread by the white brass to the effect that black soldiers could be good, but only when officered by whites. Our solidarity was strengthened when the Army attempted to remove Colonel Charles R. Young from the regiment. Young was the first black West Point graduate and the highest-ranking black officer in the regular Army. He wanted to go to overseas very badly, but it was quite clear that they did not want a black officer of his rank over there. He was examined by an Army medical board and found unfit for overseas service. We all knew it was a fraud. It was in all the black papers and was known by all the blacks throughout the country. We men didn't let our officers down. We were out to show the whites that not only were we as good as everything they were, but better. In Camp Logan, our regiment held division championships in most of the sports: track, boxing, baseball, etc. We had the highest number of marksmen, sharpshooters, and expert riflemen. Of course, there was no socializing between blacks and whites, but it was clear that we had the respect, if not the friendship, of many of the white soldiers in the division. In fact, despite all the efforts of the command, there was a certain degree of solidarity between the black and white soldiers in our division. In Spartanburg, North Carolina, white soldiers from New York came to the defense of their black fellows of the 15th New York, when the latter were attacked by Southern whites. Many of us felt that in the case of a showdown in the town with the local crackerdom, we would get the support from at least some of our white members of our division, who had happened to be around. At least, we felt that they would not side with the crackers against us. The high morale of the regiment, the new tolerance, at least on the part of the local white establishment, the new spirit of the Houston blacks were all displayed during a parade of our division in downtown Houston, about 2 months before our departure. We received a notice from headquarters about that the regiment was to participate in the parade. We were to pass and review before the Governor Howden of Illinois, our host governor of Texas, high brass from the War Department, and other notables. We spent a couple of days getting our clothes and equipment into shape. We washed and starched our khaki uniforms, bleached our canvas leggings snow white, cleaned and polished our rifles and sidearms, shined our shoes to a mirror gloss. On the day of the parade, we marched the 5 miles into town, halting just before we reached the center of the city. We wiped the dust from our rifles and shoes and continued the march. Executing perfectly the change from squad formation to platoon front, we entered the main square. With our excellent band playing the Illinois March, we passed the reviewing stand with our special rhythmic swagger, which only the black troops could effect. We were greeted by a thunderous ovation from the crowds, especially the blacks. I believe all of Black Houston turned out that day. The next morning, the Houston Post, a white daily, headlined a story about the parade and declared that the best-looking outfit in the parade was the Negro 8th Illinois. Given final leave, we bid goodbye to our girls and friends in Houston. After that, security was clamped down and no one was allowed to leave the camp. A few days later, we boarded the train, and we were on our way to the port of embarkation. We didn't know where we were headed, but suspected it was New York. Instead, 5 days later, we wound up in Camp Stewart near Newport News, Virginia. In Newport News, we barely escaped a serious confrontation with some local crackers and the police. The first batches of our fellows were given passes to the town were subjected to the taunts and slurs of the local cops. "Why don't you darkies stay in camp? We don't want you downtown making trouble." Several fights ensued, and some of our men from the regiment were arrested and others were literally driven out of town. They returned to the barracks, some of them beaten badly, and told us what had happened. A repetition of the riot of the 24th Infantry at Houston was narrowly averted, as a number of us grabbed our guns and were about to head downtown. We were turned back, however, by our officers, who intervened and pleaded with us to return to our barracks. Among them was Lieutenant Bennett Lee, who we all loved and respected. "Don't play into the hands of these crackers," he said. "We'll be leaving any day now. All they want us to do is get in trouble on the eve of our departure." "How about our guys who were arrested?" "Don't worry, we'll get them out." We returned to the barracks, and sure enough, our comrades were returned the next day, escorted by white MPs. We spent the next day on standby orders, apparently waiting for the ships to arrive. After that, all leaves were cancelled. It was on the same day, I believe, that we first learned that we had been separated from our 33rd Illinois Division. Henceforth, we would be known as the 370th Infantry. On the morning shortly after this, we looked into the harbor and saw 3 big ships. We knew then that we would soon be on our way. The following morning, the regiment had marched down to the dockside to board ship. Yet another incident occurred at the dock. We lined up in company front facing the harbor and halted a few yards from the fence, which ran the entire length of the dock. Facing us in front of the fence were several groups of loitering white native males, probably dock workers. They stared at us as if we were some strange species. Our captain apparently wanted to move the company closer to the fence and give the command, "Forward march," but he forgot to call halt. That was all we needed. We were still angry about the beating of our comrades in downtown Newport News a few days before. We marched directly into the whites, closing in all of them, cursing and cuffing them with fists and rifle butts, kicking and kneeing them. In short, applying the skills of close order combat we had learned during our basic training. Of course, we didn't want to kill anyone. We just wanted to rough them up a bit. We were finally stopped by the excited cries of our officers. "Halt! Halt!" We were through, opening up a path through which our victims ran or limped away. Then, at the command of "Attention! Right face!" we marched along the dock in columns of 2s and finally boarded the ship. On to France. We sailed for France in early April 1918 on the old USS Washington, a passenger liner converted into a troop ship. I've crossed the Atlantic many times since, but I can truthfully say that I've never experienced rougher seas. Our 3 ships sailed out of Newport News without escort. Of course, we were worried. There were rumors of German submarines. Our anxiety was relieved when, in mid-ocean, we picked up 2 escort vessels, one of which was the battlecruiser Covington. When we reached the war zone about 3 days out of Brest, a dozen destroyers took over, encircling our ships all the way into the port. It took us 16 days to reach Brest, France, when we arrived on April 22nd. We were so weak on landing that one half of the regiment fell out while climbing the hill to the old Napoleon barracks where we were quartered. Immediately upon our arrival, we were put to work cleaning up ourselves and our equipment, notwithstanding our weakened condition. The next morning we passed in review before some U.S. and French big brass. The following day we boarded a train. We crossed the whole of France from east to west and detrained at Granvars, a village in French Alsace, close to the Swiss frontier. There we found out that we had been brigaded with, and we were to be an integral part of that French army. The reason we had separated from the white Americans was, as the white brass put it, to avoid friction. But the American command of General Pershing was not satisfied to just separate us. They tried to extend the long arm of Jim Crow to the French. The American staff headquarters, through its French mission, tried to make sure that the French understood the status of blacks in the United States. Their secret information bulletin concerning the black American troops is now notorious, though I did not learn of it until after I had returned from France. The Army of Democracy spoke to its French allies. It is important for the French officers who have been called upon to exercise command over black American troops or to live in close contact with them to have an exact idea of the position occupied by Negroes in the United States. The increasing number of Negroes in the United States, about 15 million, would create for the white race in the Republic a menace of degeneracy, were it not for that an impressionable gulf had been made between them. Although a citizen of the United States, the black man is regarded by the white as an inferior being with whom relations of business or service are only possible. The black is constantly being censured for his want for intelligence and discretion, his lack of civic and professional consciousness, and for his tendency towards undue familiarity. The vices of the Negro are a constant menace to the American, who has repressed them sternly. For instance, the black American troops in France have, by themselves, given rise to as many complaints of attempted rape as the rest of the army. Conclusion. We must prevent the rise of any pronounced degree of intimacy between the French officers and black officers. We may be courteous and amiable with these last, but we cannot deal with them on the same plane as the white American officers without deeply wounding the latter. We must not eat with them, we must not shake hands with them, or seek or talk or meet with them. With them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend too highly the black American troops, particularly in the presence of white Americans. Make a point of keeping the native cantonment population from spoiling the Negroes. White Americans become greatly incensed at any public expression of intimacy between white men and black men. Familiarity on the part of the white woman with black men is furthermore a source of profound regret of our experienced colonials, who see it in an overwhelming measure of the prestige of the white race. Apparently this classic statement of U.S. racism was ineffectual with the French troops and people, even though it was supplemented by the wild stories circulated by white U.S. troops. These included claims that the blacks had tails like monkeys, which was especially told to women, including those in the brothels. Our regiment was not sorry to be incorporated into the French military. In fact, most of us thought that the best thing that could happen to us. The French treated blacks well, that is, as human beings. There was no Jim Crow. At the time, I thought the French seemed to be free of the virulent U.S. brand of racism. The U.S. command not only wanted its front line to be all white, it also wanted the regiment commanders, even those under the French, to be white. Consequently, our black Colonel Franklin A. Dennison, our Lieutenant Colonel James H. Johnson, and two of our majors, battalion commanders, were replaced by white officers. Colonel Dennison was sent back to the States, kicked upstairs, given the rank of Brigadier General, and placed in command of the officer training camp for colored men at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Although our first reaction was anger, we became reconciled to the shift. Our new white colonel, T.A. Roberts, seemed to be warm, paternalistic, and deeply concerned about the welfare of his men. He would often make the rounds of the field kitchens, tasting the food, admonishing the cooks about ill-prepared food. He even gave instructions on how various dishes should be cooked. Naturally, this made him a great hit with the men. Our confidence in him was high because we felt that he was a professional soldier who knew his business. I remember the day the new colonel took over. A regiment formed in the village square. Colonel Roberts introduced himself. He seemed quite modest. He said he was honored to be our new commander and that he knew the record of our regiment dating back to 1892 and its exploits during the Spanish-American War. Since West Point, he said, I have always served with colored troops, the 9th and 10th Cavalry. He then turned to Captain Patton, our black regiment adjutant. Captain Patton knows me, and he was one of my staff sergeants in the old 10th Cavalry. Patton nodded. The colonel smiled and pointed to our top sergeant. Over there is Mark Thompson. I remember him when he was company clerk in Troop C of the 10th Cavalry. He went on to point to a dozen or so officers and non-coms with whom he had served in the 9th or 10th Cavalry. These men will tell you where I stand in respect to the race issue and everything else. We are going to be in line soon, and I am sure that the men of this regiment will pile up a record of which your people and the whole of America will be proud. The process of integration into the French army was thorough. The American equipment which we had been trained with at home was taken away, and we were issued French weapons: rifles, carbines, machine guns, automatic rifles, pistols, helmets, gas masks, and knapsacks. We were even issued French rations, with the exception of the wine, which our officers apparently felt we could not handle. We got all the wine we wanted anyway from the French troops. They were issued a liter, about a quart a day, for a few centimes. Could buy more at the canteens. The regiment was completely reorganized among French lines, with the machine gun company to every battalion. My Company E of the 2nd Battalion was converted into Machine Gun Company No. 2. We'd enter a 6-week period intensive training under the French instructors to master our new weapons. Our main weapon was the old air-cooled Hotchkiss, and we had to master the enemy's gun, the water-cooled Maxim. The period of French training was not an easy one. It was a miserable spring, dark and dreary, and rained incessantly the whole time we were there. There was a lot of illness, grippe, pneumonia, and bronchitis. We lost a number of men, several from our company. The men we were all in a sullen mood as the time approached for the regiment to move up to the front. Disgruntled was often voiced in the now familiar form of, what are we doing over here? Germans ain't done nothing to us. It's those crackers we should be fighting." Even while lined up in the square one day, our captain took the occasion to comment on these sentiments. "Well," he said, "I've been hearing about all this stuff about the guys saying that we weren't going to fight the Germans. Well, we certainly can't make you fight if you don't want to. But I'll tell you one thing we can and will do is take you to the front where the Germans are, and you can use your own judgment as to whether or not you will fight them or not." In early June 1918, we entered the trenches of St. Mihiel-Salins near the Swiss front, as part of the 10th Division of the French Army under General Mittelhauser. We were intermingled with the French troops in the 10th Division, so that our officers and men might observe and profit by the close association with veteran soldiers. At that time at St. Mihiel was a quiet sector. Except for the occasional shelling, desultory machine gun, and rifle fire, nothing much occurred. We lost no men. It was here, however, we made our first acquaintance with two pests, the rat and the louse, whom thereafter were inseparable companions for the entirety of our stay on the front. Undoubtedly, there were more rats than men, and there were hordes of them, regiments and battalions of rats. They were the largest rats I have ever seen. We soon became tired of killing them. It seemed a wasted effort. Some of the rats became quite bold, even impudent. They seemed to say, "I've got as much right to be here as you have." They would walk along, pick up food scraps, and eat them right there in front of you. The dark dugouts were their real havens. When we slept, we would hear their heads covered with blankets as protections against rat bites. This may seem flimsy protection, but we were so conditioned that we would awake at any attempt on any part of the rat to bite the blanket. I have often wondered why there were so few rat bites. Probably the rats felt that it was not worthwhile fooling with the live humans when there were so many dead ones around. We soon got used to the rats and learned how to live with them. It was the same with the lice. I woke up lousy after my first sleep in the dugout. My reaction to the pest was the following progression. First, I was besieged by interminable itching, followed by depression. And then I began to lose appetite and weight, finally becoming quite ill. All this was in a period of a few days. Most of the fellows exhibited the same symptoms. One might say our illness was mainly psychological, but it was nonetheless real. Since this was a quiet front, I had no difficulty in getting permission to go back to the rear for a few hours. Foolishly, I thought if I could get cleaned up just once, I would feel a lot better. I got some delousing soap, took a bath, and washed my clothes. I then returned to the front, stood machine gun watch, and then went to the dugout for the nap. Needless to say, I woke up lousy again. I told my troubles to an old French veteran who had been assigned to my machine gun squad. "Oh, it's nothing. You must forget about all that," he said. "You'll get used to it. I've been at the front for nearly 4 years, and I've been lousy all the time. except when I was in the hospital or home on leave. I took an advice which was all to the good, because I was not to be rid of these pests until 6 months later during my sojourn in a hospital at Mons-sur-Seine in Paris, after the armistice. Even then it was only a temporary respite, for then I was reinfected upon rejoining my regiment at the embarkation point of Brest. After a brief stay with the regiment, I was returned to the hospital again, deloused, only to be reinfected again on the hospital ship returning to the States. I parted the company with my last louse at the debarkation point, the debarkation hospital at Grand Central Palace in New York City. We remained in St. Mihiel's sector for about 2 weeks. We were then withdrawn and moved to a sector in the Argonne forest near Verdun, site of the great battles of 1916. We arrived there in late July 1918. We were still brigaded but with the 10th French Division. The area around Verdun was a vast cemetery with 500,000 crosses for those who had perished in that great Holocaust, each bearing the legend, Mort pour la France. The Argonne at that time was also a quiet sector. But it was here that we suffered our first casualty, Private Robert M. Lee of Chicago. The incident occurred during machine gun target practice. The first and second line of trenches ran along parallel hills, about 100 yards apart. The French had set up a makeshift range in the valley between the trenches. Behind the gun there was 2 or 3 foot rise in the earth, on which a number of French and blacks were sitting, chewing the rag, awaiting our turn with the machine gun. Suddenly there was a short burst of machine gun fire. It was not from our guns. Bullets whizzed over our heads. They seemed to be coming from behind the target. All of us scrambled to get into the communication trench, which opened into the valley. Second Lieutenant Binga Des Moines, our platoon commander, and the University of Chicago's great sprinting star, fell from the embankment on top of me. Fortunately, he was not hit. But even with his 180 pounds on my back, I made sure that 10 or 15 yards to the communication trench, crawling on my hands and knees, as fast as he could have sprinted the distance. The fire was coming from behind the target. What obviously had happened is that the Germans had cased the position of our guns and had somehow got around behind the target, and waited for a pause in our target practice to open fire on us. We never found out how they did it, for none of us knew the exact topography of the place. The French, of course, knew it, but they had assured us that the place was safe and that they had been using the range for months. We crouched down, panting, in the communication trench for about 5 minutes after the German guns ceased. The French lieutenant, bless his soul, then sent a French gun crew out to get the gun. To our great surprise, they also brought back Robert M. Lee. He was quite dead, with bullets right through his heart. He had evidently been hit by the first burst and then fallen forward in front of the embankment. All of us were deeply saddened by the incident. No one spoke as we bore his body back to the rear. He was only 19, a very sweet fellow, and was our first casualty. We buried him down in the valley beside the graves of those fallen at Verdun. The funeral was quite impressive. He was given a hero's burial, with the representatives both from our regiment and our French counterparts. We were especially impressed by the appearance of General Mittelhauser, who came down from the division headquarters to express his condolences and appreciation to the black troops now under his command. The Soissons sector. Despite the fact that we'd been in a quiet sector, it was still the front lines with its daily tensions of anticipated attack. In the middle of August, we were pulled out of the Argonne sector and sent to rest behind the lines near the Bar de Leu. We were deeply pleased by the hospitality and kindness extended to us by the townspeople there. They invited us into their homes and piled us with food and wine. Half jokingly, they told us to come back after war and they get up and pick up the girls. As we did throughout our stay in France, we deported ourselves well. For the pleasures of flesh, there were a number of legal houses of prostitution, or houses of pleasure, as they were called by the French. It was with regret that we left that area. By that time, we had become an integral part of the French army. Along with our French equipment, training, and so forth, we had affected the style of the French poilu, doughboy. The flaps of our overcoats were buttoned back in ordered style to give us more leg room while on march, as was their style. Like the French infantry, we used walking sticks, which helped ease the burden of our 70-pound equipment. French peasants along the road, hearing of our strange language and noticing our color, would often mistake us for French colonials. Not Senegalese, who were practically all black, but Algerians, Moroccans, or Sudanese. We would swing along the road to the tune of our favorite marching song. My old mistress promised me, raise a ruckus tonight. When she died, she set me free. Raise a ruckus tonight. She lived so long her head got bald. Raise a ruckus tonight. She didn't get to set me free at all. Raise a ruckus tonight. Well, come along, little children, come along, while the moon is shining bright. Get on board down the river flow. Gonna raise a ruckus tonight. But we had not escaped the long arm of American racism. We were rudely confronted with this reality upon our arrival at a small town in Compagnie front in the department of Meuse. We entrained here for our next front. The regiment was confronted dramatically with the effects of the racist campaign launched by the American high brass. Upon entering the town, the regiment was drawn up in battalion formation in the square. Before being assigned to the billet, we were informed by the battalion commander that a black soldier from a labor battalion had been court-martialed and hanged in the very square where we had been standing. It had just happened just a few weeks before our arrival. His crime was raping of a village girl. His body had been left hanging there for 24 hours as a demonstration of American justice. As a result, he told us, you may find the town population hostile. In case this is so, the major warned, you are not to be provoked or take any unabridged at any discourtesies, but are to deport yourselves as gentlemen at all times. In any case, we were only there a few days, during which we were to remain close to our barracks. Then, in lowered voices, he muttered, "This is what I've been told to tell you." We kept close to our billets the first day or so, but then gradually ventured further into the town. At first the townfolk seemed to be aloof, but the coolness was gradually broken down, probably as the result of our correct deportment, especially at our attitudes towards the children, in whom we were always immediately struck up friendships. Friendly relations were finally established with the villagers. When we asked about the hanging, they shrugged the matter off. So what? That was only one soldier. All the others were nice enough. When asked why they had been so aloof when we first arrived, they said it was the result of the warning of the white officers. They didn't want us to fraternize with the blacks. Continuing the conversation, they seemed puzzled about why the sentence should have to be so severe and the body barbarously left exposed on the square. "Très brutal, très horrible," they exclaimed. With regard to the little girl, she'd been raped many times before, one of them jeered. After 2 weeks of rest, the regiment began to move by stages towards the front lines again. A few days later, we boarded a train towards the front lines again. A few days later, we had boarded a train consisting of a long line of boxcars. Each car was marked 40 hommes en 8 chevaux, 40 men or 8 horses. The last couple of months had been quiet and relatively pleasant, with the exception of the Lee incident and the events just related. But now we felt we were going to get into the thick of it. The premonition was confirmed by the next morning when we woke, that is, those of us who had been able to sleep in such crowded conditions. We were passing through Chateau Thierry. There could be no doubt about it, even though the part of the sign had been blown away, and the only word Thierry remained. The woods around the station and the below woods a few miles on looked like they had been hit by a cyclone. Broken and uprooted trees, gaping shell holes, men from the Graves registration walking around with cuirasses, black pioneers removing ammunition, all were grim reminders of the great battles that had been fought there by American troops only several weeks before. We were on the Soissons front when we became part of the famous Armée Mangin. General Mangin, Le Bourgeois, or the Butcher as he was called by the French, was commander of the 10th Army of France, among whom were a number of shock troops, Chasseurs Alpines, Chasseurs d'Afrique, Algerians and Moroccans, Senegalese riflemen, and the Foreign Legion. His army was pivotal in breaking the Hindenburg line about Soissons. On this front, we were brigaded with the 59th French Division, under the command of General Vincedon. We bypassed Terre in the Belleau Woods and detrained at the village of Villers-Courrettes, the birthplace of Alexandre Dumas. The atmosphere was charged with expectancy. Observation balloons were hung like giant sausages on the horizon. Big guns rumbled ominously in the distance. A steady stream of ambulances carrying wounded jammed the roads leading from the front. Obviously a big battle was in progress not too far away, but it turned out that we were not going into that sector. We left the village and marched west into Crépy-en-Voisin. Turning north through the Compiègne forest, we reached the Assain River at a point near Vic-sur-Assain, and continued to Raison-le-Long, where we established our depot company. The march from the railhead to Raison took about 3 days. It was a forced march, and converted about 25 kilometers, 15 miles a day. This was pretty rough after the restless night we had spent on the crowded train. As one of the company wags observed, one thing about those kilometers, they show will kill you if you keep on meeting them. Our regiment spent 6 months in the lines in all. We took part in the 59-day drive of Mangan's 10th Army, which ended on the day of the armistice. During that period, one or another of our units were always under fire or fighting. Our toughest battles was at the Death Valley jump-off near the Assain Canal, the taking of Mont Saint, Monkey Mountain, which was later renamed Hill 370 in honor of our regiment, fighting at the railroad embankment northwest of the Guillemot Farm, and the advancements into Hindenburg Line at the Oussy-Assain Triangle. It was in the battles of the Hindenburg Line that we met the strongest enemy resistance and sustained most of our losses. The enemy resistance was broken in these battles, and they became a general withdrawal, at first orderly and accompanied by brief rearguard actions. Finally, there was the flight to the Belgian frontier, destroying roads and railroads on orders to impede our advance. After Léon, their flight was so precipitous that we had difficulty maintaining contact. We entered many villages which they had left the day before. Our outfit was the first Allied troops to enter the fortified city of Léon, wresting it from Germans after 4 years of war. We were greeted with tremendous elation from the population, who had lived under German occupation the whole of that period. The regiment was highly praised by the French. They won 21 Distinguished Service Crosses, 68 Croix de Guerre, and 1 Distinguished Service Medal. In the whole 2-month drive, casualties were 500 killed and wounded, a total about 1/5 of the regiment. These casualties were light when compared to those of black regiments on other fronts. For example, the 371st Infantry of drafted men lost 1,665 out of 2,384 men in 3 days of fighting during the Great September Offensive on the Compiègne front. I believe that the German resistance in these other fronts, east and west of Soissons, was more stubborn than on our front. All of our black regiments were fortunate to have brigaded with the French. In this respect, the American High Command did us a big favor, unintentionally, I'm sure. For as far as we were able to observe, the French made no discrimination in the treatment of black officers and men whom they had fraternized freely. They regarded us as brothers in arms. Similarly, the French people in the villages in which we stopped or were stationed were uniformly courteous and friendly. We made many friends. I must say that we were also on our best behavior. I don't remember a single incident of misbehavior on the part of our men towards French villagers. The latter were quick to notice this and contrast our gentlemanly deportment with the rudeness of white Americans. Many of the white soldiers made no effort to hide their disdain for the French, whom they regarded as inferiors, and commonly referred to them as frogs. Even as we fought, we were being stabbed in the back by the American High Command. We were not to learn, however, until the return to the States of the slanderous, racist document issued by the American General Staff Headquarters through its brainwashing French mission, the secret information concerning black American troops referred to earlier. We learned also that the hanging of black soldier on the part of the Compline Front was not an isolated incident, but part of a deliberate campaign to conduct by higher and lower echelons in the American command to influence French civilians against blacks. The campaign focused on the effort to build up the black rapist scare among them. Such was a memorandum issued by the headquarters of the 92nd Division, a black division offered largely by whites, on August 21st, 1918. Its purpose was to prevent the presence of colored troops from being a menace to women. The memorandum ran in part. On account of increasing frequency of the crime of rape or attempted rape in this division, drastic preventative measures have been made necessary. Until further notice, there will be a check of all troops in the 92nd Division every hour daily between Reveille and 11 p.m., with a written record showing how each check was made, by whom, and the result. The 1 mile limit regulation will be strictly enforced at all times, and no passes will be issued except to the men of known reliability. This was followed the next day by another memorandum saying that the Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Forces would send the 92nd Division back to the States, or break it up into labor battalions as unfit to bear arms in France if efforts to prevent rape were not taken more seriously. As a result, Dr. Robert R. Morton of Tuskegee was sent by President Wilson and the Secretary of War to investigate the charges. He found only one case of rape in the whole division of 1,500 men. 2 other men from labor battalions in the 92nd area were convicted. Of these, one of these were hanged, and I'm sure that this was the unfortunate soldier who we saw on the Compline Front. General Headquarters was forced to admit that the crime of rape, as later stated by Moten, was no more prevalent among colored soldiers than among the whites or any other soldiers. This whole racist smear of black troops, I was to conclude later, represented but an extension to France of the anti-black racist campaign then current in the States. It was designed to maintain black subjugation and prevent its erosion by liberal racial attitudes of the French. Back in the States, the campaign was marked by an upturn of lynchings during the war years, with 38 black victims in 1917, half again the number in the following year. Even then, things were working up to the bloody riots of 1919. In contrast to all of this, the appreciation for the French for black soldiers from the U.S. was shown by the accolade given by the French division commander, General Vincedon, to a regiment. On December 19, 1918, we were transferred from the French army back to the American army. On that day, General Order 4785 directed the 59th Division of the Army of France was read to the officers of the men of the 370th. It commended us for our contributions to France. I remember being struck by the poetry of the language. It was all beautifully French to me. We at first, in September, at Bras-sur-Orque, admitted your fine appearance under arms, the precision of your view, the suppleness of your evolutions that presented to the eye of the appearance of silk unrolling its waves. Further on, remembering our dead, the communique read, the blood of your comrades who fell on the soil of France, mixed with the blood of our soldiers, renders indissoluble bonds of affection that unite us. There were 2 of us in the compartment, another soldier from the regiment and myself. I felt a little drowsy, so I told my compartment mate that I was going to take a little nap and wake me up when the chow came around. I awoke 5 days later in the French hospital in Mont-Saussagne, near Paris. They had put me off the train as an emergency cage did before Paris. I came out of a coma to find a number of strange people around my bed, nurses who were Catholic nuns, doctors, and a number of patients. They were all smiling. "Thank God, young man," said the doctor. "We thought we were going to lose you. You've been in a coma for 5 days, but you're going to be all right now." "Where am I? Is this Paris?" I asked. "No, this is Mont-Saussagne, close to Paris. They've had to put you off as an emergency case." "What's wrong with me?" I asked. "Oh, you've had a kidney infection, and it affected your heart." "That sounds bad," I said. "Well, you're young, and you have a remarkable constitution. You'll pull through all right. You're out of danger now," he assured me. I remained in the hospital for about a month, receiving the kindest and most solicitous attention from the nurses, doctors, and patients. All seemed to regard me as their special charge. No one spoke English, but I got along all right. It was like a crash course in French. They told me I had a beautiful accent. They brought in an old lady to talk English with me, but she bored me to death. Really, my French was better than her English. She came once and didn't return. I was feeling much better when the head nurse came to me one evening to tell me I was to leave the next morning for Paris to the American hospital in Neuilly. "You've never been to Paris, have you?" she asked. "No." "Well, you've got a treat coming." I was filled with great expectations. The next morning, after embracing all my fellow patients and exchanging warm goodbyes with the doctors and sisters, the head nurse, or sister, took me out from the hospital where an American ambulance was waiting. "Hop in, buddy," said the driver. "Haywood, be sure to write us when you get back to Chicago," said the sister. "Remember, we are your friends and want to know how you are getting along." I promised I would. As we pulled out, she stood on the road, waving a white handkerchief and continued to wave it as long as we were in sight. I never wrote them, but often thought of them. Paris, you wondrous city. I was feeling good that morning as we pulled into the hospital at Neuilly. The hospital was situated on the Avenue Neuilly, near the Boulevard de la Grande Armée, only a few blocks from the Arc de Triomphe. It was a veritable palace. I was assigned to a ward in which there were only 4 guys, 3 Australians, and 1 white American from Wisconsin. They greeted me and gave me a rundown on the situation. They were having a ball seeing Paris, taking on all the events, theaters, racetracks, boxing, and girls. I don't believe that I ever saw a real sick man in that hospital. There were some, of course, but they must have been secluded in some of the out-of-sight wards. We were all convalescents in our ward. A couple were recuperating from wounds received at the front. "What do you do for money?" I asked. "Oh, don't worry about that. Just stick around a while, and we'll show you the ropes." Under their tutelage, it didn't take me long to catch on. At that time, there were dozens of rich American women, including the number from the Social Register in Paris. They were under the auspices of the Red Cross and had taken over the hospital and its patients as their special war duty. They would organize excursions, get tickets for shows, sporting events, etc. Coming to the hospital in relays, they would leave huge boxes of chocolates and other goodies. We were showered with gifts: Gillette razors, Waterman fountain pens, and even some serviceable wristwatches if you asked for them. They would come in waves. Scarcely had one group left when another would come, leaving the same gifts. The guys had it down perfectly. They always left one man on watch in the ward. He was there in case the gals would come in while the others were out, and receive all their presents and gifts for them. He would point to the 3 unoccupied beds — there were only 5 of us in an 8-bed ward — and pretend that their occupants were also out on the streets. He would suggest that the presents be left for them. Also, old Wisconsin Slim was the real genius in all this. He even hung a couple of crosses over the unoccupied bed to give more substance to the fiction that they were occupied. Every morning we would gather all of our presents, take them to the gate, and sell them for a good price to the French who gathered there to buy them. We would then return to the ward and divide the swag. Razors and fountain pens seemed to be rare in France at that time. Going for the rate of razors was about 10 francs, $2, and the Waterman fountain pens were even more. All of this carried out under the benign gaze of the hospital authorities. Discipline was lax, almost non-existent. We could stay out for 2 days at a time. The attitude seemed to be, let the boys have a good time, they deserve it. Besides, it is essential for their convalescence. When we would get a little money together, about once a week, we would all run out to the Montmartre and the famous Rue Pig Alley, to see the girls. As an old Francophile, I was also interested in French history and culture. I got a guidebook and spent the days walking all over Paris, visiting the historical places about which I had read, mentally reconstructing the events. Time was passing rapidly. I had been in the hospital about 2 months when an administrator called me into his office. "Well, Corporal Hall," he said, "I hope you've been having a good time in Paris." "Oh, yes," I replied. "That's good. We're sending you back to your regiment tomorrow." "Where are they?" I asked. "They're in Brest, waiting to embark for the voyage home." The next morning I got on the train at the Gare Oist and arrived at Brest that evening. In Brest I strolled around a bit on the waterfront and finally sat down at a sidewalk cafe. I was in a hurry to get back to the old regimental harness. I was about to order a drink when suddenly a white MP appeared. Glowering at me, he said, "Where's your pass, soldier?" "Here it is. I just got back from the hospital in Paris, and I'm going to my outfit up the hill," I explained. He grabbed it and glanced at it and shouted, "Well, get going up the hill right now. You're not supposed to be hanging around here." I left without my drink and started climbing the hill to the old Napoleon barracks where we had been 11 months before. It seemed like that had been years ago. So much has been crowded into the brief intervening period. I rejoined my outfit. We were living in tents in what seemed to be like a swamp. The weather was miserable, a steady cold rain. The mud was ankle deep. I was greeted warmly by my comrades. I don't think more than half of the old boys of my company were left. The rest were dead, wounded, or ill in hospitals all over France. A couple bottles of cognac were produced. The guys started reminiscing about what they were going to do when they got home. News from home was bad. Discrimination and Jim Crow were rampant, worse than before. Blacks were being lynched everywhere. "Now they want us to go to war with Japan," observed one of the fellows. The Hearst newspaper at the time were raising the specter of the Yellow Peril. "Well," someone said, "they won't get me to fight their Yellow Peril. If it comes to that, I'll join the Japs. They're colored." There was a unanimous agreement on that point. I bunked down that night and awoke the next morning with a high fever. I went to the infirmary and again was evacuated to the hospital. I immediately began to worry whether I would be able to return with my outfit. I was waiting on the side of the road to hitch a ride to the hospital. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and there was Colonel Roberts, our white commander who I had not seen for months. I started to spring to my feet and salute, but he motioned me to remain seated. "Corporal, you're from our regiment, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," I said. "I'm sick and going to the hospital." "What's the matter?" "I guess I got the flu." "Well, you're in no condition to walk the distance." He hailed a passing truck and instructed the driver to take me to the hospital. "Take care, son. We're going to go home soon. Try to come back with us." That's the last time I saw Colonel Roberts. A month later, while in the hospital, I picked up the Paris edition of the Herald Tribune. The headline read, "The 370th Infantry, the old 8th Illinois, returns and is given a hero's welcome and victory parade down State Street." I felt pretty bad because I can imagine my old mother standing there waiting for me to pass. Since I hadn't written in months, she would probably assume the worst. I had been away from the States for quite a while, in free France, so to speak. I had become less used to the American N-word-hating way of life. But I was thrown abruptly back into reality as soon as I crossed the threshold of the American Army Hospital in Brest. There seemed to be manned by an all-Southern staff, doctors, nurses, etc. All of them spoke with the broad Southern accents. I was assigned to a bed at the end of one of the wards. When I looked around, I could only see other blacks at that end. Whites were at the other end. There were no screens, no Jim Crow signs. The Jim Crow was de facto, but nonetheless real. I also noticed that there was a large space between the black and white sections. After a cursory entrance examination, the doctor seemed to think that I didn't have the flu, and upon hearing my recent medical history, had decided that it was a relapse of the old illness. I had no sooner gotten settled when I heard a nurse bawling out at a black soldier for being so dirty. The poor fellow had just come in from some mud hole like the one in which my regiment was situated in, where there was no opportunity to bathe. "Don't you all see you don't see any of our white boys that dirty?" she shouted, her eyes flashing indignantly at what she, a white lady, was forced to put up with. For the first time it occurred to me that our black regiment had been put in a worse location than the whites. Now that had been a pretty hard stuff for the front-line veteran to take. If I had been ill when I came in, I was really sick now. I could feel my blood pressure and fever mount. There was a black sergeant from my outfit in the same ward. He was a tall, dignified, and proud-looking man, convalescing from a previous illness. He wasn't a bed patient, and was therefore supposed to make his own bed. This he did, but he never seemed to do it, to the satisfaction of the nurse, who kept berating him. "Make it over, it's not good enough. I've made it already, and I'm not going to do it again." "Don't talk back to me," she shouted. "Make that bed." "I'm not going to," he said. "You dare disobey my order?" she yelled. "I'm a front-line soldier, and you don't have to yell at me." She turned and walked to the office and returned with the ward doctor, a little pipsqueak of a man. In a stentorian voice he said, "Make that bed, soldier." The sergeant didn't move. The doctor looked at his watch and said, "I'm giving you 2 minutes to start making that bed. If you don't, I'm going to prefer charges against you for disobeying your superior officers." You could see that the sergeant was thinking it over and was coming to a decision. I could almost read his mind. It seemed that he was thinking that this wasn't the time to die. He only had a couple more months to go. He finally burst into tears, but he got up and made the bed. I've seen this sort of situation before, and I feel almost certain that had there been a loaded gun around, the sergeant might have started shooting. It would have been reported in the news as, "Another N-word runs amok." All of us, including some of the whites, breathed a sigh of relief at this peaceful culmination of what could have been a dangerous incident. At least the nurse never bothered the sergeant after that. Undoubtedly, she sensed the inherent danger of any further provocation. After my stay in Paris, I seized periodically by moods of depression. These deepened and became chronic during my stay at the Brest Hospital, especially after witnessing such humiliating incidents. I felt I could never again adjust myself to the condition of blacks in the States after the spell of freedom from racism in France. I did not want to go back, and my feeling was shared by many black soldiers. I thought of remaining in France, getting my discharge there, and possibly becoming a French citizen. But I did not know how to go about this. Besides, I was ill, and there was my mother who wanted to see me again. Probably someday, if I got well, I would come back. Or so I thought as I lay in the hospital in Brest. Finally, the day came. We were discharged from the hospital, given casual's pay, 1 month's pay, in which my case amounted to $33, and boarded the ship for home. There's no change in the Jim Crow pattern. We were merely transferred from a Jim Crow hospital to a Jim Crow hospital ship. We blacks found ourselves quartered in a separate section of the ship. The segregation, however, did not extend to the mess hall or the lavatories. Heads. I guess that would have been too much trouble, but the ship's military command passed up no opportunity to let us know our place. For example, on our first day, we were given tickets for a mess, breakfast, lunch, and supper. We were supposed to present them to the checker who stood at the foot of the stairwell leading up to the mess hall. A black soldier, who had evidently misplaced his ticket, tried to slip by the checker unnoticed, but he was not quick enough. The cracker officer was standing by the checker and hollered, "Hey, N-word, come back here." The guy kept going and tried to merge to a group of blacks who had already come to pass. Again, the officer shouted, "N-word, come back here. You, I mean the tall one over there. That N-word knows who I'm calling." The soldier finally turned around and walked back. Purple with rage, protected by his bars and white skin, the officer said, "Listen, you black son of a bitch, where is your ticket?" Clearly, the officer had already gauged his man and concluded that there was no fight in him. "I couldn't find it," said the soldier. "Well, why didn't you say that in the first place instead of trying to slip through here?" "Well, you go on back and try and find it. If you can't, see the sergeant in charge. Don't even try that trick again," said the officer. His anger seemed to ebb and glow of self-satisfaction spread across his face. He had done his chore for the day. He had put an N-word in his place. The seas were rough again. It was a small ship, leased from the Japanese. Most of us were seasick. The sailors were having a ball at our expense. When one of us would rush to the rail of vomit, one of them would holler, "$1, he comes." One night, the ship tilted sharply, and a number of us were thrown from our bunks. The bunks were in tiers, and I was on the top one. I got a pretty hard bump. The next morning on deck, the sailors were talking loudly amongst themselves, for our benefit, of course. "Gee," said one, "this is the roughest seas I've ever seen. This old pile is going to come apart. The Japs leased us the worst ship they had." It just might be sabotage," one suggested. "I hope we make it, but I'm not so sure," said another. Not being seamen, most of us were taking this seriously. A black soldier turned to me and said, "You know, man, after all I've been through, if this ship were to sink now, almost inside of home, I would get off and walk the water like the good Lord." Another voice, that of a white sergeant from Florida who had been rather friendly to us. "You know," he drawled, "that reminds me of old Sam down home. Here it comes," we thought, one of these N-word jokes. He was up there on the gallows with the rope around his neck, and the sheriff said, "Well, Sam, is there anything you want to say before you die?" "All I got to say, Sheriff," said Sam, this show would be a lesson to me. The voyage proceeded uneventfully, with one exception. The gamblers among us were out to get the soldiers' casual play. The law of concentration of money into fewer and fewer hands was in the process. This was taking place by one of the endless crap games which started in the Bay of Biscay and round up at Sandy Hook. I never really gambled, even the army with room and board, guaranteed. If you were broke, you could always borrow some money. The lender knew you couldn't run out on him. His only risk is that you might become a casualty. But motivated by knowing nothing more than sheer boredom, I got into the game this time. After all, what good was $33 going to do to me? To my surprise, I had a streak of luck that over a period of a week, in and out of the game, I ran my paltry go-up stake into a tremendous sum of $1,200. That was the high point at which my time with luck began to peter out. Nevertheless, I left the ship with $500. It was the last of my gambling venture. That morning we lined up at the rail as we ship passed Sandy Hook and pulled into New York Harbor. It was my first view of New York skyline. Overcome with emotions, tears welled up in my eyes. Embarrassed, I looked around and found that I was not alone. The guy next to me was obviously crying. Our landing was a memorable one. Ship's stacks were blasting, foghorns blowing, bells were ringing, and fireboats were sending up great sprays of water. Passengers and ferry boats were waving and shouting greetings. Upon docking, we were met by two reception committees of young women, a white one to receive the white soldiers and a black one to greet us. This time segregation didn't bother us at all. We were so pleased to see the pretty black girls. They drew us aside as we came down to the gangplank, ushered us into waiting ambulances, and drove us to Grand Central Palace, which we had been converted into debarkation hospitals. Leaving us in the lobby, they said goodbye and promised to come back soon and show us around. The road home. The road back from Sejons lay through the old battlefields which we had fought a couple months before. Near Anzin-le-Château, there were crosses marking graves of some of our comrades who had died in the fighting there. We paused before our graves, seeking out those of the comrades we knew. We all had the same thoughts. What rotten luck they should die almost in sight of victory. Among the crosses was one marked Sergeant Theodore Gamelin. Gamelin hadn't died in combat. I remember the incident clearly. We were all lined up in some hastily dug trenches that morning, waiting for the over-the-top signal. The cooks had just distributed reserve rations. These consisted of half-loaf of French bread, not the crispy white kind, but the coarse grayish loaf, baked especially for the troops, which we called war bread, and a big bar of chocolate. Somehow Gamelin had missed out on these rations. Jump-off time was drawing near. He looked around and his eyes fixed upon a private named Brown, who was sitting on the firing step, putting his rations in a knapsack. Now, Private Brown was one of those quiet, meek little fellows. He always took low and was never known to fight, but Brown was the type of man, I have observed, who can become dangerous. This is particularly true in a combat situation where one doesn't know whether he will live 5 minutes longer. Gamelin, a big bullying type, an amateur boxer, and very unpopular with his men, called to Brown. "Give me some of that bread, Brown. I didn't get my rations." "Now that's just too bad, Sergeant," Brown responded. "I'm not going to give you any of this bread. It's not my fault you missed your rations." Gamelin, with one hand on his pistol, moved as though he were going to seize bread. Brown had his rifle lying on his lap. He simply raised it and coolly pulled the trigger. The sergeant fell dead. The platoon commander heard the commotion and ran to the spot, inquiring what had happened. Men told him that Gamelin was trying to take Brown's reserve rations and had made a move towards his pistol. Brown, they said, had shot him in self-defense. Obviously nothing could be done about Brown in those circumstances, so the lieutenant said, "Consider yourself under arrest, Brown. We will take up this matter after this action." Unfortunately, Brown was killed a few days later. The memory of this incident was on our minds as we viewed Gamelin's grave. His helmet hung on the cross, which ironically bore the inscription, "Sergeant Theodore Gamelin, Mort pour la France, died for France, September 1918. I'd gone through 6 months at the front lines without a scratch or a day of illness, but as we neared Soissons, I began to feel faint and lightheaded. By the time we reached the city, I had developed quite a high fever. It was in the period of the first great flu epidemic, which wreaked havoc among U.S. troops in France. I reported to the infirmary and lined up in a group of around 50 men. The medical sergeants took our temperature and then tied tags to our coats. I looked at mine and it read influenza. We were evacuated to a field hospital near Soissons, where I remained for about 5 days. After that, we boarded a hospital train, and we were told that we were going to a big base hospital in Paris. Now, I like that. I've never seen Paris, and I was almost anxious by the visit to the famed city before going home. A woman from the Red Cross took our home addresses to notify our families of our arrival. We were then escorted into a large room and told to strip off our clothes. Leaving them in the room, we then went through the delousing process. We were sprayed with some sort of chemical and washed off under the showers. We were then given pajamas in a bathroom and shown to our Jim Crow ward. The next day, after a physical examination, we were paid off, receiving all of our back pay. In my case, it was for 12 months, amounting to about $450. This, plus the $500 I had won on the ship, seemed to me a small fortune, the largest amount of money I've ever had in my life. I was, so to speak, chafing at the bit, raring to get out and up to famed Harlem. On the ship, I met a black sergeant named Patterson, who was from the 369th, the old 15th New York. He had also won a considerable sum in the crap game. He suggested that we team up and go to Harlem together. He said he knew his way around there, since that was where he lived before he joined the army. After the payoff, we were still without clothes, but clothing salesmen came around to take orders for new uniforms. Patterson and I ordered suits, for which we were measured. In a couple of hours, the man was back with 2 brand new whip-cord uniforms and chevrons and service stripes sewed on. We had also ordered shoes, which we were promptly delivered. We then sneaked out of the hospital. After we banked most of our money downtown, we took the subway up to 125th Street and visited several buffet flats, a current euphemism for the high-class whorehouse. Drinking and looking over the girls, Patterson seemed to be an old friend of the madams. They greeted him like a long-lost brother. We finally rounded up in one real classy joint where we stayed for 4 days, playing Sultan in Harlem with the girls. We returned to the hospital, expecting to be sharply reprimanded and restricted to our quarters, but the doctor, on his rounds, really asked, "Where have you boys been?" Before we could answer, he simply said, "I suggest you stick around a day or two. We have some tests to make." From New York, we left for Camp Grant, near Rockford, Illinois, where we were demobilized out of service. I was discharged on April 29, 1919. After a cursory examination, I was pronounced physically fit. "What about my chronic endocarditis and chronic nephritis?" I protested. "Oh, you're all right. You'll overcome it all. You're young and fit as a fiddle," the doctor answered me. From Camp Grant, I returned home to Chicago to see my parents. Reunion with Otto. Not long after my discharge, I came home one evening to find Otto. He had just arrived after mustering out of service at Camp Grant. We were all happy to see him, especially Mother. He showed us his honorable discharge. "You know," he said, "I'm lucky to get this." He then told stories of his harrowing experience in the Stevedore Battalion in the South and then in France. The main mass of black draftees had been relegated to these labor units, euphemistically called service battalions, engineers, pioneer infantry, etc. Regardless of education or ability, young blacks were herded indiscriminately into these stevedore outfits and faced with drudgery and hard work, with no possibility of promotion beyond the rank of corporal. With a few exceptions, the officers were KKK whites, also were the sergeants. Many of them were plantation-riding boss types, especially recruited for the job. Southern newspapers had openly carried want ads calling for white men who had experience in handling Negroes. Black draftees were not only subjected to the drudgery of hard labor, but insults, abuse, and in many cases, blows from white officers and sergeants. Otto told us his worst experience was in Camp Stewart in Newport News, Virginia, where he was stationed during the terrible cold winter of 1917 to 1918. For a considerable period after their arrival, they were forced to live in tents without floors and stoves. In most cases, they had only a blanket, some not even that. New arrivals to the camp were forced around fires outside all night, or sleep under the trees for partial protection from the weather. For months there were no bathing facilities or clothing for the men. These conditions were subsequently changed as a result of the protests by the men and reports by investigators. His outfit landed in the port of Saint-Lazare, France, and during the Great Advance participated in the all-out effort to keep the front line supplied in the race to Berlin. They worked from dawn to nightfall unloading supplies, including all kinds of railroad equipment, engines, tractors, and bulldozers. They built and repaired roads, warehouses, and barracks. Discipline was strict, and guys were thrown in the guardhouse on the most flimsy pretexts. A black soldier was seen on the street with a French woman and was likely to be arrested by the MPs. The spirit of Saint-Lazare, said one officer, is the spirit of the South. Needless to say, Otto often found himself in the guardhouse as a result of fights, AWOLs, etc. How he escaped general court-martial or imprisonment, I don't know. His outfit was finally moved to the American military base at Le Mans, about 100 miles from Paris. Things were somewhat better there. There were even a few reliable black corporals who were allowed weekend passes to Paris. Otto was assigned to mess duty as a cook. When he applied for leave, he was refused. However, well, I didn't intend to come this close to Paris without seeing this, he said, so I went AWOL. He did not see much of it, however, before he was arrested by MPs. I was surprised to learn that he had been in Paris during the period I was in the hospital in Neuilly. Most of his time in the great city was spent in the Hotel St. Anne, the notorious American military jail run by the sadistic Marine captain Hardboiled Smith. Now bitter and delusioned, Otto continued his rebellion. It led him first into the Garvey movement, where he served for a brief period as an officer in Garvey's Black Legion. Then in succession, Wobblies, or the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, the African Blood Brotherhood, and finally the Communist Party, joining soon after its Unity Convention in 1921. After returning from service, Otto stayed home only a short time, and then moved in with some of his new friends. And that concludes Chapter 2 of Black Bolshevik. Thank you all for joining me for the second episode of the Book Club Commune and the second chapter of Black Bolshevik. Next week we will be reading Chapter 3, Searching for Answers, a long one which is going to be 40 pages long, so expect a long episode for that one. Until then, solidarity with everyone, and keep on reading.